News, and we're here again talking to you about Miami community health. And of course, health is very important, and we now have another important health topic that we're going to cover today. You know that February is Heart Month, and of course, we're going to talk about the heart today. And what better than talking about the heart than a cardiologist? What better than the chief of cardiology? I only bring you the best here at this show, and so we have Dr. Jonathan Fialkow with us today, who's going to talk to us about the heart. Welcome, John.
Thank you. You'll make my mother very happy with that introduction.
Of course. Yeah, moms are the proudest. So, of course, we're here talking about the heart. And so let's talk about heart disease. What exactly is heart disease?
Yeah, great question. And you can talk to 10 different people. You get 10 different answers. But, the heart is a major organ of our body. It pumps blood and nutrients to the rest of our body. When we talk about heart disease in the conventional wisdom, we're talking about kind of coronary artery disease, the blockages of the arteries that occur over time that lead to heart attacks and strokes and various other components. But I always like to tell my patients there's 4 components of heart disease. So one is coronary artery disease, the pumps. The second is the muscle itself. And as you probably know, congestive heart failure is a condition when the pump doesn't work well. And it's the most common reason for admissions in the United States and a big driver of cost as we get older. Electrical problems, arrhythmias, and then the fourth one are valve problems, structural problems. So as heart disease has progressed in our understanding, it's blood flow, coronary artery disease, electrical problems, heart muscle, and then the valves. But coronary artery disease is mostly what we talk about when we're talking about heart disease in the conventional wisdom.
Because coronary artery disease and these heart attacks that people have, that's what's most likely going to take somebody's life? Is that what the concern is?
Yeah, so heart disease remains the #1 killer of men and women in the United States, more than all cancers combined, more than lung disease, more than accidents. And the majority of those are the vascular components like we're talking about. So if someone's got, I tell my patients, if you got, let's say, a partially blocked artery in your heart right now, which I could, 3 things can happen. Nothing. You die at a ripe old age of something else and you never knew you had it. It can slowly narrow, and that can lead to chest discomfort when you are active. You go to the doctor. You might get a stress test to evaluate it. We find a blockage. We open it up. But you were stable. It was when I'm exerting myself, I feel some symptoms. But the third one is what you're alluding to. We don't want that artery that's inflamed to suddenly rip and a blood clot forms, and all of a sudden a part of the heart muscle is not getting blood. It's dying. That's a heart attack. And that's what kills you. Either the heart muscle pump can't function or you get electrical problems, but we want ultimately to avoid that event. How do you avoid the event? Find out who's got risk for the event and intervene, and that's the art of a cardiologist, if you will. But yeah, it's the blood flow and the heart attack is what we want to avoid. Biggest killer in the United States. I'll give you one other point. About 1 in 3 people with heart disease find out when they have a heart attack. So you're feeling good, everything's fine, and that first event is your sign of
you never knew it. You never knew there was a problem.
Never knew it was a problem.
Wow. So, of course, we want to prevent this from happening. And you mentioned risk factors. So is it genetic? Is it acquired? Is it because I'm eating the wrong type of foods? Why does heart disease develop?
Yes.
Okay. All of that.
Again, the different level of conversation and what I tell my patients, and then we can get into granular things. I look at it as a product of society. I look at it as a product of our lifestyle. If you think about it, we didn't evolve to open a fridge and there's 1,000 calories, sit in a chair and be on a TV show, go to sleep 5 hours after the sun goes down because we're watching bright screens. So part of our evolution is our civilized life is contrary to what our body wants. Now, going back to the specifics, when we start doing things to our body that the body doesn't want to do, eat too much food, smoke, we develop an inflammatory process. Inflammation is the body's reaction to something foreign, right? You get a splinter and you get an inflammatory reaction to get rid of that foreign substance. And that's kind of what's happening in our arteries. Things are inflaming our arteries, leading to this disease, which can lead to blockages. Now, what are those things? Yeah, the biggest one is age. I mean, arguably, it's something that accumulates over many years. So the older we are, the more at risk we are. Second are genetics. There are things both in terms of genetic disorders and family histories that make people more likely to get inflamed. But then you got things like smoking, elevated blood pressure, abnormal cholesterol. I'm a lipid specialist. I don't use the term high cholesterol. It's not really the amount of cholesterol, but how it travels in your body, diabetes and inflammatory process. And then we're looking at other things like sedentary lifestyle, stress, not getting enough sleep or having sleep apnea, various components of our diet. So multifactorial, and that's why it's both humbling and why people should get checked out. You might say, I don't know, I run and I don't smoke, but maybe you have something else that's contributing to it. So we don't want people to be scared, but we don't want them to be ignorant of they could be developing cardiac disease as well.
Yeah, so there are things that are in our control like eating and smoking, but there are certain things that even if you're as fit as you are and doing exercise that you can't control. Could be genes, of course, right?
Genes, age, and gender. Men tend to get heart disease earlier than women. After menopause, women's rates of heart disease accelerates. It's the number one killer of women in the United States as well. But from an age standpoint, being a man is a risk factor. Can't change that.
Yeah.
Can't change your genetics. Can't change your age. So that determines when you start saying, I got to pay attention. 20-year-old marathon runner, knock yourself out. 55-year-old relatively sedentary guy with a little bit of a belly. All right, it's time for me to start checking this out.
So, of course, you mentioned the changes that have occurred in our world and, of course, in the U.S. and the evolution. And we have seen more obesity because of the sedentary lifestyle, because of the TV, because of the computer, and the kids not playing outside.
Processed foods,
right.
Environment.
Are we seeing the heart disease increase as well?
Yeah, so it's very interesting when you look at the trends. And going back 40, 50 years, when we started seeing an increase in heart disease, and through various other things, which may be another show about some dietary recommendations, which might have been wrong from our guidelines, and telling people to eat more carbohydrates and less fat, etc. But many things have happened. And if you track the trajectory of obesity and diabetes, which really skyrocketed in the late 70s, heart disease went along with it. Now, I'll tell you something else. Then for many decades, we actually started having a little bit of a drop in heart disease deaths, not heart disease, but people dying, not dying. Why? Increased medications, statins, beta blockers. These were revolutionary medications. If you're having a heart attack, we can get you to a hospital. We can open up the artery. So we weren't seeing a decrease in heart disease. We were seeing a decrease in heart disease deaths because of our interventions. But now it's going up again. And arguably, well, why after decades of decreased heart disease deaths, in the last 6, 7 years, it's gone up? And one of the arguments is we've not developed any kind of new blockbuster therapies past the bread and butter statins, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, blood pressure medications, but we're more obese and older. So if we're a less healthy population and we don't have major new weapons to decrease heart disease death, we could expect those numbers to go up if I'm articulating it well.
Wow,
So the lifestyle change, the processed foods, sitting on our butts, going to sleep late, these are increasing heart disease, and obesity, diabetes are part of that underlying ill health that we have as a society.
Yeah, wow. No, it's an incredible description of how we have become more sedentary and become more obese, which is, basically beat heart disease.
And Tony, if you think about this, and again, I just love these types of thoughts, is we're evolved to be sedentary, right? We evolved in a very uneven food supply, right? Early human was find a meal, eat it, find a meal. You didn't find that meal, you went out part of that gene pool, you died of starvation. So our bodies are meant to let someone else do the work. If I don't have to do that physically, I don't want to do it because arguably, evolutionarily, I gotta be preserving my energy. But now we got plenty of food around. So our bodies preserve energy. We want to be sedentary, but our ability to get food when we want it is not consistent with that. And it's thought to be one of the reasons why, again, we have more obesity and these inflammatory diseases, right? If you can let someone else do something, let them do it. Why would I want to do it? Because that's hurting us. Yeah.
Well, of course. So we want to control, we want to avoid the heart attack, we want to avoid the early death, and we want to obviously take care of ourselves. Does everybody need to see a cardiologist? And what type of things can we control to try to, prevent this heart disease?
So I hope my colleagues don't kill me, but no, everyone doesn't need to see the cardiologist. No, everyone shouldn't be on a statin. These are conversations. But the reality is at some point in everyone's life, and there are different medical organizations that'll say when it should be, 25, 30, you want to get blood tests. You want to get a lipid profile. Check your cholesterol, triglycerides. These are things that are indicators of a higher cardiac risk. You want to have your blood pressure checked. People don't get up in the morning and say, I bet you my blood pressure's high today. So you want to start checking the markers, the things that go on in your body that say, oh, I might be developing things that could put me at risk of a heart attack. And that's the general checkups and things like that. Now, where should someone see a cardiologist? I think robust primary care can generally do good cardiac risk assessments in asymptomatic people and adjust medications or lifestyle appropriately. Someone starts having symptoms that could be cardiac, or someone's medical problems are a little bit beyond what a general medical visit will entail. Again, I'm a lipidologist. I deal with complex lipid disorders. These are kind of things that the primary care doctor is doing a wonderful job, just can't control because they're so complex. Then you want to escalate it. On the other hand, I get a lot of people saying, I'm 40, I want to see a cardiologist. I'm like, no, man, go to a primary care doctor. It's what your primary cares are for. And as a cardiologist, I'm not going to take care of the other stuff. So what I'm saying is you want to have a cardiac risk assessment, but it doesn't have to be by a cardiologist. High risk that either can't be controlled, symptoms, shortness of breath, chest pain, swollen ankles, yeah, get to a cardiologist real quickly. But within our primary care environment, that's where you want to get your cardiac assessments done.
And of course, you mentioned primary care. They got to check those simple things. Your weight.
Sure.
They say your waist circumference is very important, right? And of course, you mentioned your lipid profile, but make sure you don't have diabetes. I mean, I see, of course, an obese population of patients, and they haven't been to doctors in years, and they could have diabetes and high blood pressure.
So you know this well, the apples and the pears.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about weight as it relates to the inflammatory process that leads to heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, it's generally a weight distribution that's different. The people who gain the weight in the belly, it's a metabolically active weight gain, and that's usually associated with the cardiac risk. People who gain it, in other areas, it may not be as much.
The hips.
So if you're built like an apple, get yourself checked. If you're built
Yeah.
like a pear, that's more genetics. I tell people all the time, of course, if I say to a woman, if you're going to gain 10 pounds, can you say I want it in my boobs and not my butt? There's genetics, there's hormones, there's lots of things that people can't arguably control, but the big picture we can control. So going back to that original premise, yeah, did you gain weight? I get into sleep histories. Disrupted sleep, not getting enough sleep, sleep apnea, which also could be weight related. These are cardiovascular drivers. They lead to arrhythmias. So some of the things that are obvious, what's my blood pressure? I smoke. No one's going to argue those. But there are subtle signs that someone might be at risk that I won't say it's necessarily missed by others, but it might not be in the front of their radar. And that's kind of why we're trying to educate these things. Gout, low testosterone, again, abdominal obesity. These are markers of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. How many people have a fatty liver? Patients with fatty livers, they have heart attacks because something's inflaming their body as evidenced by the excess fat in the liver, which leads to the cardiac issue. So that's why we want to identify all these components to get the person identified and healthier. How can we prevent a heart attack? Who's at risk? Let's identify that risk and do something to lower the risk.
So how do I know what my risk is? I mean, I was sent by my primary physician to get a calcium
score.
Calcium score, a CAT scan of my heart, and they tell me what your calcium burden is, and thank God mine was whatever, it's zero. It's nothing.
Zero.
So it's
Thank
great.
your parents.
Great. so that was great. I was happy to hear that. Okay. But I actually had a friend who says, hey, my calcium score is whatever, very high. I don't know if it was like 500 or some number like that. And
I got patients in the thousands.
Yeah. And so he had to go see a cardiologist. So. Is that what you should be doing? How do I know what my risk is?
I love it, and I wish I'd given you that question to ask us. It would have made me look smart. But here's the deal. So we take a population of people, and we want to identify those that are at risk of something. First thing we have to understand is we're dealing with probabilities. We're not dealing with certainties. So if I tell you, this is your calcium score based on these data, and I'll explain the calcium score in a minute, you've got an 8% chance of a heart attack in 10 years, which is how we actually talk. What's my chance of a heart attack? And you could look at it and say, well, that's a 92% chance. I'm not going to have a heart attack. See you later, doc. And I can't tell you that's wrong. But if you're in the 8%, you're not too happy about the other 92%. So the goal is, what's my risk? But we're not at the point yet that we can tell who's the 8% and who's the 92%. And that leads to confusion. For example, you may hear people say, well, there are too many people on statins. And arguably, if I got 100 people who may have a heart attack and 5 of them are going to have a heart attack, I'm going to treat them all with a statin because I don't know who's the 5 and who's the 95. So going back, if we're doing an assessment of cardiac risk, there's different screening things we can do, and there are scores. There's actually an app. It's put out by the American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association. I have it. Age, gender, sex, triglyceride level, cholesterol, blood pressure, do you smoke? And it gives a score based on population data. How old are you, if I can ask? And you'll say
52 now.
Okay, 52-year-old Caucasian gentleman with these types of things, your risk is 3% over 10 years, 15%, et cetera. Now, you can take that and say, over a certain amount, I'll do something about it. Over 5%, we might put you on a statin. Over 15%, we might be more aggressive. But that score is not great because we wind up telling people just based on numbers, you have a higher risk than they may, and we scare them, or the risk is really low and they have a problem. So that's where the calcium score comes into play. If I look at 10,000 60-year-old smokers and 10,000 60-year-old non-smokers, and I follow them for 10 years, I'm going to see more heart attacks in the group that smokes. But not every smoker has a heart attack, and not every smoker doesn't have a heart attack. So if you say to me, I smoke, am I going to have a heart attack? I'm going to say, I have no freaking idea. You're more likely than if you didn't smoke, but I don't know what's going to happen. But now we want to get specific. You want to know what's going to happen to me. And right now, the calcium score in the right person is the best predictor in an individual. So that calcium score is a sign of how much inflammation I have in my arteries. That's heart disease. We don't have a test for inflammation, but inflammation over time will calcify. And we have a simple, cheap, safe test for calcium. And through decades of data, we can say 52-year-old Caucasian male with this calcium score, based on our population, you have this risk of a heart attack. Do we do something about it? So a calcium score, to me, as a preventive cardiologist, is an extremely powerful weapon. But you have to be kind of over 40 years old for it to be valid, because you need time of the inflammatory process to calcify. Over 70, 75, we don't know what it means. I mean, should an 80-year-old have some calcium in the arteries? We want to use the tool to say, what's my chance of a heart attack? So if you're in that 40 to 70 group, it's great. If you've been on a statin for many years, you don't need a calcium score, because arguably when you get calcium score, if it's elevated, it says go on a statin. You're already on it. Why make the decision? And most importantly, what I see is if you've already had evidence of vascular disease, you don't need a calcium score. I have people who've had bypass surgery. Doc, should I get a calcium score? I'm like, what? To tell me your risk of cardiac disease? You said bypass surgery. But I do think the calcium score is great. And more importantly, if the calcium score is 0, that doesn't mean your arteries are perfectly normal, but it means at this age, your chance of a heart attack over the next 10 years is so low, you don't need to do anything about it, right? Who's at risk? How high is the risk? What do we intervene? Calcium score is 0. You're not at a high risk. We don't need to intervene. Other people who feel well, calcium score is elevated, based on the numbers, that's the risk. Let's get you to a cardiologist. Let's lower that risk with an intervention.
So should we, I mean, you mentioned this app. Should I mean, I'm gonna get this app and see what it's like.
ACCHA, pooled cohort risk
Right.
calculator.
And so, and then when you get that app, that's doable by any individual?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So somebody does that app at home, and then should everybody be getting a calcium score? Well, insurance is safe for the calcium scores.
The app will give you a risk over 10 years. Arguably, you do it once a year.
Okay.
Age is a component. You need some blood tests. And part of, to me, a general physical yearly should be the doctors or the nurse or the APP calculates the risk, but you can do it yourself if you have the right parameters. Right now, if the app says your 10-year risk is under 5%, we generally say repeat it next year. Do the calculation a year from now. My risk is low, leave me alone. If it's over 7.5%, generally it's, we're going to put you on a statin, depending on how high, over 10%, maybe a baby aspirin. 5 to 7.5% 10-year risk is that. What do we do here? Right now, the guidelines say if that risk is 5 to 7.5%, then you do a calcium score. Calcium score 0, leave them alone. Calcium score high, above it. If it's over 7.5%, the calcium score may not be of great value because your risk is high by other parameters. Now, that's evolving. We may get to the point where the calcium score becomes the first test. But again, that's why you talk to your doctor and you'll see if it's appropriate. It's not covered by insurance, though most places will do it for under $100.
Oh, wow.
It takes about 3 minutes. I tell people
it was crazy.
You park and you're back in your car in less than 15 minutes. It's done at most centers, nights, weekends. It does require a physician prescription. But I say it's okay to ask, doc, should I get a calcium score? And some docs may say, didn't think of it, sure. But don't demand the calcium score, because sometimes it's not going to bring value or it'll scare you. I'll give you another example. Once the calcium score is elevated, remember, the calcium score is a marker of risk to say treat the person. Once it's elevated, don't do it again, because it's going to stay elevated. It's an age-related phenomenon. It's only going to get worse over time. The calcium is not the problem. The calcium is a marker of inflammation, which is the problem, and we don't measure. So if your calcium score is 100 and we put you on proper medications and repeat it next year, it's going to be 120. And you're going to say, why is it going up? I'm doing everything right. And that's the natural course of the calcium score. So again, great tool in the right hands and the right person, but if done incorrectly, it can lead to anxiety and some things like that.
It's funny you mentioned how fast the test is. When I had mine done, I get there, I was like, I don't know, I was in my scrubs, and I take off my ID and everything else, and I get it done, and the guy does it, and it literally takes like 3 minutes to do. And he goes to me, we're done. I said, what do you mean we're done? He goes, we're done. I go, can we do it again? He goes, no, I'm going to get in trouble if we do it again. So anyway,
no injections. It's not a radiation mammogram. It's really very, you don't want to do it and by the way, if you do the calcium score and it's 0, you repeat it in 4 to 5 years.
Okay.
So it's a predictor for 10 years. So if you 4 to 5 years repeat it and now it's elevated and we intervene then with medications, whatever, you're still protected against that event.
So we talked about the calcium score, and we should get that test. Now, the other test, should everybody get a stress test? I can tell you a personal story. I was doing missionary work in Haiti, and I was airlifted over here because of chest pain. And I went through a stress test and everything else, so I know what that's like. But should everybody get a stress test? That's really, exercising under observation by a cardiologist.
You got to give me a recording of this so I can play it in my offices and stuff.
Okay.
That's a great point. So a stress test is not a screening test. It's done that way, but it's wrong. So let's go back a little bit. The goal of prevention is taking someone who looks good and feels well Is there anything going on that could cause a problem that we can prevent, right? I tell people I can prevent heart attacks, I can prevent strokes. Do women get mammograms to prevent breast cancer? No, it's to detect it early.
Right.
I can't prevent a meteor from crashing into this studio 5 minutes from now, but we can prevent heart attacks and strokes. How high is the risk? What's the intervention? You have to have a blockage over 75% to show up on a stress test.
Oh, wow.
The thinking was an artery would slowly narrow, and maybe if I just do a stress test and I find an 80% blockage in an asymptomatic person, I can get to them and prevent the heart attack. But what we now know is the degree of narrowing does not correlate with the heart attack. Remember, it's the heart attack we want to present. So if you're sitting here right now with a 30% blockage in one artery and an 80% blockage in another artery, and you have a heart attack a month from now, which one caused it? It could be the 30%. It's inflamed. Remember, we talked about this. Think of a pimple in your artery. It pops and a blood clot forms. So a stress test will not predict an asymptomatic person having a heart attack. I could put you on a treadmill and you'll do great. It'll come back normal and you have 360% blockages and one of them rips a month later. So in asymptomatic people, a stress test can be falsely positive, which leads to unnecessary testing, give the wrong sense of security. So doc, I'm good to go. Yeah, you can have a heart attack tomorrow, but stress tests look good. Where a stress test really comes into play is in someone having symptoms and you're not sure what are the symptoms. So in your case, you said you were having chest pain. Most chest pain is not cardiac, but you didn't know, and you obviously weren't having a heart attack. So we'll do a stress test to help differentiate, was that pain a sign of a cardiac condition or not? So I've had people come in and say, I want to see you. My buddy had a heart attack. I want a stress test. Like, I'll do a stress test, but it's not going to prevent you having a heart attack. Let's get your cholesterol checked. Let's get a calcium score.
Right.
So I think when you say what's the proper preventive medicine evaluation, let the doctor decide that. Don't come in asking for something preconceived. A stress test in an asymptomatic person more often than not gives wrong information than otherwise.
Yeah, well, we've heard definitely the calcium score, and you're right. I had too much hot sauce in some food in Haiti, and of course,
to me, there's no such thing as too much hot sauce. I'm sorry about that.
It was too much hot sauce. It gave me a stomach ache, and so. All right, so let's talk about a topic that you and I had a meeting about yesterday, cardiometabolic disease. Tell our audience, what is cardiometabolic disease?
Okay.
Even for me, that was a new topic.
It's a term that's an evolution, but what we recognize that cardiac disease, heart disease, what we started the conversation was, is really a metabolic disorder. Something is wrong with our metabolism that leads to inflammation of our arteries. And previously, we looked at those metabolic components as individual medical problems. You have high blood pressure, don't eat salt, take this pill. Your cholesterol is a little high, take this pill. Your sugar's high, take this pill. But we now know the underlying metabolic disorder represents those conditions. So if you have hypertension, you have an inflammatory disorder, but you're more likely to have a cholesterol abnormality and you're more likely to be gaining weight and lead to diabetes. So the underlying metabolic condition that leads to cardiac disease is that because of insulin resistance. It's something with your body that's inflaming your body. It manifests as elevated blood pressure, abdominal weight gain, elevated triglycerides, low good cholesterol, diabetes, sleep apnea, but we're now looking at them holistically. So if a person comes into me with high cholesterol, I may address it, but I'm also going to find out their sleep habits. We're going to look at their sugar levels. We're going to find out what their diet is. And the cardiometabolic disorders ultimately lead to diabetes, is usually seen to leading to a diabetic, but it leads to heart disease and kidney failure. And that's what we want to avoid. If your blood pressure is high right now, and I have a crystal ball that says you'll be dancing in my grave at 120 years old on no meds, who cares about your blood pressure? The blood pressure is a marker of something going on metabolically that can lead to heart attack, which is why we address it. But no longer do we just address it by take a pill for your blood pressure, but you got high blood pressure. Let's make sure you don't have let's make sure you don't have other metabolic components that we're ignoring. Let's make sure we're really giving you the benefit of a proper evaluation for those cardiovascular disease risks.
Yeah, we're taking care of the entire patient and not just, focusing.
Not the disease or the number,
right?
The patient holistic.
Yeah, that's kind of what, when you guys send me a patient who has diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, lipid, dyslipidemia, and they're obese, if we can help them with their obesity, then,
Tony,
of course.
You can predict it. You got a patient walking in your office and the belly is the first thing that comes in the office. What do you know? Triglycerides are high, HDL is low, the sugar is going to be high if they're not frankly diabetic. They're going to have high blood pressure by new standards. They probably have sleep apnea. Just that one component is a sign of all the other components. Wow. And again, historically, it's not a criticism, it's our evolution of understanding. The doctor appropriately or the patient would concentrate on one thing. Why are you putting me on a cholesterol pill? I'm here for blood pressure. Let's talk about that. And again, we talk about diet and activity. We're not just throwing pills at people, but it's a new way of approaching things. It's a confluence of these previously independent medical conditions that we now realized are the same underlying problems. Something's inflaming our body. Arguably it's sugar, arguably it's the other things we talked about. You're at one end of the spectrum dealing with the hormonal energy storage and its consequences. I'm on the other end dealing with the medical consequences of those conditions. And arguably, it's why we're talking together professionally. If we can provide this holistic approach to the patient, we expect to get better outcomes.
No doubt. And of course, what we've learned today so far is that, getting a good primary doctor to do a good evaluation, take care of you as a holistic patient and check everything, not only your blood pressure, and obviously send you for a good screening test at the appropriate age is going to be important. Now, so part of it is in the physician's hands in making sure that you get a good evaluation and you're treated holistically. But there's part of it that's in the patient's hand, in our hands. And two of the topics I want to kind of finalize with are, our eating habits, sugar, and of course our recreational habits, smoking. So why don't we talk to us about, the dangers and the what causes this, the sugars and the smoking to our bodies.
So I don't want to. Actually, I'm totally happy to be in a kind of class, but it's a different conversation. But arguably, we are living organisms. We require nutrition, and there are 3 macronutrients that give human beings energy, right? Fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. I always look at things from an evolutionary standpoint, and you know this. There are essential fatty acids we must consume as human beings: omega-3s, omega-6s. We don't make them; we need them. We die if we don't eat them. There are essential amino acids, protein. There's no essential carbohydrate. We do not need to eat carbohydrates, as our bodies will manufacture the sugar, the glucose our body needs for energy. And what sugar really is, or glucose and carbohydrates really are, is good storage forms of energy, right? You don't really store protein that well. You'll store it in your muscles, but you burn it. But if I got food coming in and I don't need it right now, I'm going to store it. And it's usually the carbohydrates that get stored, and it's usually stored as our belly fat. Why is this relevant? A lot of the heart disease and our chronic disease is from an over storage of energy. We have more food, energy than our body needs, doesn't know what to do with it. And a big driver of the storage is sugar, right? Fat doesn't really trigger hunger. Fat doesn't trigger, it's got calories, which are units of energy. I tell people, so what if I've got calories, if I got 10 calories from sugar and 10 calories from fat, what does that mean? Nothing. Calories are a unit of measurement. It's like I have a pound of feathers and a pound of bricks. A pound. Right. Calorie means nothing. What we do with the energy. So going back, sugar and simple carbohydrates trigger storage hormones. The storage hormones make us heavier. The body doesn't know what to do with that energy, which leads to an inflammatory response, which leads to high blood pressure, abnormal cholesterol, etc. So I think this focus on fat in the diet, because it's got calories, doesn't take into account satiety, right? Fat makes people full. You put the plate away. Carbohydrates, when they're burned through, make you hungrier. And that's the evolution. And part of my problem in the cardiology world is we've got so much baked into this low-fat message, which means you're going to need carbohydrates in its place. Now, granted, if you follow plant-based diets or true Mediterranean diets, which is kind of a creation, there's no Mediterranean diet, you'll be okay. But arguably, you could eat a lot of other foods that you're avoiding that you don't want to eat. To me, it's mostly the carbs. It's the carbs and the sugar. And sugar is not part of our natural diet. It's so pervasive, as you know. So again, I don't know how much you want to go into that. Let's switch to smoking.
Okay, smoking. No, I think you've gotten the message across that sugars are no good. Stick mainly.
I give a
fats
lecture on
and
10
protein,
things you can do to avoid heart disease, and 3 of the slides are avoid sugar, avoid sugar, avoid sugar. Okay. And by the way, that's natural sugars too.
Right.
Honey, by the time it's in your belly, it's sugar. Smoking. So smoking, which fortunately in the United States, we've made great inroads in decreasing smoking for many decades with public education and whatnot. Interestingly, one of the areas of a high level of new smokers is college-age women, and they don't know if it's a peer pressure thing or keep weight down or something. So we got work to lead to significant direct effects on our blood vessels. Really, every part of our body is negatively affected by smoking. Nicotine is what's called a vasoconstrictor. It constricts blood vessels. It leads to inflammation inside the arteries, which then causes inflammatory response. So when I have people who quit smoking, I tell them, no matter what you're going to do in the future, you've helped yourself more by quitting smoking than anything else. And of course, it's an addictive substance. Now, what's interesting is I got a lot of people say, well, I just smoke cigars. And cigars ain't great. I mean, the nicotine of cigarettes are such that, you could smoke them all day. Cigars have a lot of nicotine. They have so much acid and tars in them that people say, well, I don't inhale. but the nicotine gets absorbed right through your cheeks. It gets right to your brain. So cigars are just as dangerous. Now, maybe you don't smoke them as frequently. Marijuana tends to be, if we're allowed to say, it's not as bad for your cardiovascular system as other forms of combustible products, but there's still a cardiac risk. Vaping, which is not combustible products, it's the chemicals. Again, they're the ones which most of them have nicotine. That's the problem. It's the nicotine. So smoking affects our blood vessels. It affects every part of our body. Makes this metabolic inflammatory process worse for the underlying effects. So don't do it.
Okay.
Don't start.
No, of course.
But don't fool yourself with the cigar thing. I smoke cigars. I don't inhale. Yeah. To your heart, it doesn't matter.
Well, no, I'm glad you asked. You mentioned the vaping, because I was at a wedding this past weekend, and I hadn't seen somebody in a long time, and we sat together, and all of a sudden I see him with a little flash drive, smoking like literally a flash drive. He goes, "Oh, this is the coolest thing. You need to invest in this company." I'm like, "Invest in this company? You're smoking a little flash." So anyway, so cigars, cigarettes, anything with nicotine, not good.
Right.
Sugar's not good. Go see your primary doctor and get an evaluation. And as we close, we're trying to focus on the heart and heart month in February. And, of course, the heart, you always want to make sure that thing is ticking and your ticker is working. So, get a good evaluation by your primary physician, get a risk assessment, get a calcium score if appropriate, and then try to control your habits.
Absolutely.
To try to have, avoid that heart attack and create early detection. So, what other final points do you want to tell our viewers, or maybe what's on the horizon for us?
I appreciate that. First of all, it's the opportunity to communicate with you and the viewers. Mention this component is appropriate. Diet, eat foods in the most natural process. If you eat foods in the most natural form, an orange, peel it. Orange juice isn't natural. There's no orange juice tree. So think in those terms and you're okay. Risk factor reduction, we talked about. Stay active. Make sure you get a good night's sleep. Don't look at the thing. Don't just look at blood test results. But I think the take-home message before we just get to coming on the rise is listen to your body. I mean, too often people are having signs of an impending cardiac problem, just really unexplained fatigue, getting a little more winded walking to the mailbox than you were before, a little swelling in the ankles, difficulty lying flat in bed. They don't really recognize it or they deny it. Get yourself checked out. The earlier we can get to you, the better we'll be able to avoid the permanent damage that we want to avoid. So I think, listen to your body. And then as far as what's new on the horizon, we do have, I don't just like using medications, but we do have some really powerful new medications that have been developed specifically towards the genetic abnormalities, specifically towards what's going on. My biggest need is a little bit more science behind our diet recommendations and nutrition. I call nutritional science an oxymoron. I mean, we really do need more of a scientific commitment to it. There's a lot of industry money in those recommendations, a lot of programs. I'm sure you see it as well, because we're really not recommending to our population the right thing. And to that point, not everyone has to follow the same diet. If you want to lose weight, it's a different diet than if you want to avoid gaining weight. And that's where it gets complicated and stuff, but I don't think we're going to resolve that here.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, John, and thank you to all the cardiologists and all the cardiologists at Baptist Health and throughout our community. And remember, February is Heart Month, so take care of your heart and take care of your body. Once again, Dr. Anthony Gonzalez here, signing off from Miami Community Health, and we'll see you next time.